Before we start tonight's story, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? Drop a comment below, and if you're enjoying the stories, make sure to like and subscribe. It was a crisp autumn morning when the Thompson family stumbled upon the quaint little flea market on the outskirts of town. Rows of old furniture, dusty books, and vintage trinkets stretched endlessly under the golden sunlight. Emma, the youngest in the family at 8 years old, tugged at her mother's hand, dragging her toward a stall brimming with antique toys. Among the collection, one item stood out: a porcelain doll, dressed in a lacy blue gown with eyes so lifelike they seemed to follow you wherever you moved. "She's beautiful, Mommy. Can we take her home?" Emma pleaded, her wide eyes sparkling with excitement. Emma's mother, Clara, felt a chill creep up her spine as she gazed at the doll. There was something off about it, something she couldn't quite put into words. Its painted lips seemed to curve into a faint, knowing smile, and its glassy eyes gleamed unnaturally. But Emma was insistent, and against her better judgment, Clara handed over a crumpled $10 bill to the vendor, who accepted it with an odd, almost relieved expression. As they drove home, the doll sat perched on Emma's lap. "Her name is Charlotte," Emma declared. Clara glanced at the rearview mirror and could have sworn the doll's head was tilted differently than before. She shook the thought away. It was just her imagination, she told herself. That night, Clara tucked Emma into bed, placing Charlotte carefully on the shelf by the window. "Good night, sweetie," she said, kissing Emma's forehead. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards. Clara and her husband, Mark, had just drifted off to sleep when a faint sound stirred her awake. It was a soft patter of footsteps. "Emma," Clara whispered, sitting up. The hallway outside their bedroom was empty. Dismissing it as a trick of her mind, she returned to bed. The next morning, as Clara prepared breakfast, Emma skipped into the kitchen, cradling Charlotte. "She wanted to sleep with me last night," Emma said cheerfully. Clara frowned. "I thought I left her on the shelf," she murmured, but Emma was already engrossed in a conversation with the doll, giggling as though Charlotte had told her a joke. Days turned into weeks, and the air in the Thompson household grew heavier with unease. Clara often found Charlotte in places she didn't recall leaving her: the dining table, the living room couch, even on her and Mark's bed. "Emma, are you moving the doll around?" Clara asked one evening, trying to keep her voice steady. Emma looked up from her drawing, her expression earnest. "No, Mommy. Charlotte moves herself. She likes exploring." Clara's stomach knotted. She laughed nervously, brushing off Emma's words as childish imagination. But the incidents grew harder to ignore. Once, Clara found Charlotte sitting upright in the middle of the kitchen floor, her head tilted as though watching her. Another time, Mark swore he saw the doll's hand twitch out of the corner of his eye. The whispers started soon after. Late at night, as Clara lay in bed, she would hear faint murmurs, almost like a child's voice, coming from Emma's room. Each time she checked, she found Emma sound asleep with Charlotte tucked on her arm. One stormy evening, Clara decided she'd had enough. "This doll is creeping me out," she told Mark, holding Charlotte at arm's length. "I think we should get rid of it." Mark nodded. "Emma's not going to like it, but I'll take it to the thrift store tomorrow." That night, Clara woke to the sound of Emma screaming. She rushed to her daughter's room to find her huddled in a corner, pointing at Charlotte, who sat upright on the floor, her head facing the door. "She was standing by my bed," Emma sobbed. "She was staring at me." Clara's blood ran cold. Mark grabbed the doll and stuffed it into a box in the garage. But even sealed away, the oppressive presence lingered. The whispers grew louder, and now they were accompanied by laughter, a high-pitched, sinister giggle that echoed through the halls. The next day, Clara did some digging. She found an old newspaper article about a local tragedy. Decades ago, a little girl named Charlotte had gone missing. Her body was never found, but her favorite doll had been discovered floating in the lake behind her house. It was said that Charlotte's spirit had latched onto the doll, seeking revenge on anyone who dared to take it. Panic set in. That night, as the family huddled together in the living room, the power went out. The house was plunged into darkness, and the whispers grew deafening. "Mommy," Emma whimpered, "Charlotte's coming." A thud echoed from the hallway, followed by the sound of tiny footsteps. Clara's heart pounded as she saw a shadow moving toward them. Mark grabbed a flashlight and shone it down the hall. There stood Charlotte, her glassy eyes glinting in the beam, her tiny porcelain hand raised as if beckoning them. "Leave us alone," Clara screamed, grabbing the doll and throwing it into the fireplace. The flames roared to life, consuming Charlotte. For a moment, the whispers turned into an ear-piercing scream, and then silence. The Thompson family moved out of the house soon after, unable to shake the lingering memories. Emma never asked for another doll again, but sometimes, late at night, Clara would wake up, certain she heard the faint sound of tiny footsteps echoing in the distance. Charlotte was gone, but her presence would haunt them forever. The legend of Hollow Lake was as old as the town itself, whispered among generations and kept alive through cautious warnings. The lake was stunning by day, its surface a glassy mirror reflecting the emerald trees that encircled it. But by night, it transformed into a place of foreboding shadows and bone-chilling silence. Locals knew to steer clear after sunset, lest they encounter the crying woman. It was on a brisk autumn evening that Grace and her friends decided to test the boundaries of their courage. They were young, restless, and skeptical of ghost stories. Hollow Lake seemed a perfect backdrop for their thrill-seeking adventure. Armed with flashlights and snacks, they set out to camp near its edge. "You really think we'll hear her?" Max asked, his voice betraying a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "It's just a story," Grace replied with a dismissive wave. "Some tragic tale about a woman who drowned herself here centuries ago. Ghosts don't exist." The group laughed, though the sound felt out of place against the lake's eerie stillness. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of deep orange and purple. Soon, darkness enveloped them, and the temperature dropped sharply. As the group sat around their crackling campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories, the first unsettling sound reached them. It was faint, a distant wail, almost indistinguishable from the wind. Grace froze, the marshmallow on her stick forgotten. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's just the wind," Max said quickly, though his eyes darted toward the lake. The sound came again, clearer this time. It was a mournful cry, filled with despair. The laughter and chatter ceased, replaced by an uneasy silence. Grace's friend Mia gripped her arm. "That didn't sound like the wind," Mia said, her voice trembling. Max grabbed his flashlight and shone it toward the lake. The beam of light danced across the water, revealing nothing but rippling reflections. "See? Nothing there," he said, though his hands shook slightly. But Grace wasn't convinced. She stood and stepped closer to the water's edge, her curiosity outweighing her fear. The air grew colder with each step, and a strange heaviness settled over her chest. Then she saw it, a shadowy figure standing waist-deep in the lake. The figure was barely visible, shrouded in mist. Long, dark hair clung to a pale face, and her shoulders heaved with sobs. Grace felt a chill crawl down her spine. "Hey, are you okay?" she called out, her voice echoing unnaturally. The woman didn't respond. Instead, she turned her head slightly, revealing hollow, sunken eyes that seemed to pierce through Grace. A wave of terror washed over her, rooting her to the spot. She couldn't look away as the woman began to wade closer to the shore, her movements slow and deliberate. "Grace, get back here," Mia yelled, snapping her out of her trance. Grace stumbled backward, nearly falling over a rock. The woman stopped, her head tilting to one side as if listening. Then, without warning, she let out a blood-curdling scream. The sound was deafening, filled with anguish and rage. The group scrambled away from the shore, their flashlights flickering wildly. The night only grew stranger. As the friends huddled in their tent, trying to rationalize what they had seen, the wailing began again. It seemed to come from all around them, rising and falling like a macabre melody. Shadows flickered across the tent walls, though no one dared to look outside. Max clenched his flashlight tightly. "This is insane. We need to leave." "And go where?" Grace snapped. "The car's a half-hour hike away, and you want to walk through the woods with that thing out there?" Mia whimpered, her face buried in her hands. "Why did we come here?" Suddenly, the tent zipper began to slide down. The friends froze, their breath caught in their throats. Grace grabbed the nearest object, a heavy flashlight, and held it up like a weapon. The zipper stopped halfway, and a pale hand reached inside. Screaming, the group bolted out of the tent and ran blindly into the woods. The wailing grew louder, closer, as if chasing them. Branches whipped against their faces, and the uneven terrain threatened to trip them at every step. Grace glanced over her shoulder and saw the woman gliding through the trees, her feet barely touching the ground. The group finally stumbled upon an old cabin near the edge of the woods. They burst inside, slamming the door behind them. The interior was dilapidated, filled with cobwebs and the smell of damp wood. Max leaned against the wall, panting. What the hell was that? Grace's eyes fell on a dusty bookshelf. Among the tattered books was a leather-bound journal. She opened it, her hands trembling. The entries told the story of a woman named Eleanor, who had lived by the lake over a century ago. Accused of witchcraft by the townsfolk, she had been drowned in the lake as punishment. Her spirit, consumed by vengeance and sorrow, had been haunting the lake ever since. "It's her," Grace whispered, her voice shaking. The crying woman. Before anyone could respond, the wailing returned, louder and more insistent. The cabin door rattled as if something, or someone, was trying to get in. The group backed away, their eyes wide with terror. Grace's mind raced. If Eleanor's spirit was tied to the lake, perhaps returning something to it could appease her. She grabbed the journal and bolted out of the cabin, ignoring her friends' protests. The woman was waiting for her near the lake, her figure illuminated by the pale moonlight. Grace's heart pounded as she approached, holding the journal out like an offering. "I'm sorry for what happened to you," Grace said, her voice breaking. "You didn't deserve it. Please let us go." The woman tilted her head, her expression unreadable. Slowly, she reached out and touched the journal. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, she began to fade, her form dissolving into the mist. The journal fell to the ground, its pages fluttering in the breeze. By dawn, the lake had returned to its serene beauty, as if nothing had happened. The friends retrieved their belongings and left without a word, the weight of the night's events pressing heavily on them. Grace never returned to Hollow Lake, but the woman's cries occasionally haunted her dreams. She often wondered if Eleanor had found peace, or if she was simply waiting for her next visitor. It was the kind of house you would expect to find in an old, forgotten part of the neighborhood. Quiet, secluded, and a bit run down. But for Sarah and Tom, it was perfect. They had been looking for a fresh start, a place to call their own after the chaos of their past. When they stumbled upon this house, it seemed like the ideal solution. The price was right, and the charm of its aging wood floors and creaky windows was endearing. There was something about it, an eerie yet comforting presence, that drew them in, and they didn't hesitate to sign the papers. At first, everything was as it should be. The creaks of the house settling were nothing more than the normal sounds of an old building. The dust that accumulated on the hardwood floors felt like a reminder of the house's history. Nothing sinister, just age. But that feeling began to change over time. It started with the footsteps. At first, they were faint, barely audible, like someone walking softly across the floor above them. Sarah dismissed it as the house's age. Old houses had a way of making noises, she reasoned. But as the days passed, the footsteps became more consistent. Every night, like clockwork, they echoed through the halls. Soft at first, like a whisper, they would reverberate down the stairs and across the living room. Sarah would turn to Tom, asking if he heard it too, and he would nod, trying to convince her that it was just the house. Old houses creak, Sarah. It's nothing. But the feeling in the pit of Sarah's stomach told her otherwise. Then the footsteps grew louder. One night, as they sat in the living room, Sarah jumped at the unmistakable sound of someone walking across the upstairs hallway. It wasn't a creak or a groan from the house. It was distinct, deliberate, as if someone was pacing, taking one step after another in rhythm. Sarah's heart raced, her breath caught in her chest. She tried to laugh it off, but Tom's face was pale. He heard it too. "I'll go check it out," Tom said, standing up. But his voice trembled, a stark contrast to his usual calm demeanor. He made his way to the stairs, and Sarah followed. The house felt cold, unnaturally so, as though the temperature had dropped several degrees. Tom reached the top of the stairs and flicked on the light, his hand shaking. The silence was deafening, but there it was, the unmistakable sound of footsteps moving away from him, down the hallway. They were getting louder, as though someone was walking right toward him. "Sarah," Tom called out, his voice quivering with uncertainty. I don't see anything." But as Sarah stood at the bottom of the stairs, the footsteps continued, almost mocking them with their persistence. There was no one up there, nothing that could explain it. Tom turned and slowly descended the stairs, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. The footsteps stopped abruptly as he reached the bottom, and for a moment, the house was silent once again. Over the next few days, the footsteps became more frequent, more pronounced. At night, they would start at odd hours, echoing through the house when it should have been empty, when everyone was asleep. No matter where Sarah or Tom went, the footsteps followed, always just behind them, always loud enough to make their hearts race with terror. They weren't just haunting the upper floor anymore. Now, the footsteps could be heard in the kitchen, in the living room, even in the basement. "I don't think it's the house," Sarah whispered one night, her voice barely audible in the dark. "I know," Tom replied. His voice was strained, and Sarah could tell that he was just as terrified as she was. The dread gnawed at them both, settling like a weight on their chests. They no longer felt at home in the house. It had become a prison, with the footsteps as its cruel warden, keeping them in constant fear. They couldn't escape them, couldn't ignore them. The footsteps were relentless. One night, desperate for answers, they called in a paranormal investigator. Lena was a woman with sharp features, her dark eyes full of knowledge and skepticism. She arrived at their house just as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the front yard. Tom and Sarah showed her around, pointing out the spots where the footsteps were the loudest. Lena listened intently, nodding as if she had heard this all before. When they reached the attic, she paused. "This is where it starts," she said quietly, her voice low. "The footsteps, whatever is causing them, began in the attic." Sarah shivered, remembering the sound of the footsteps that had echoed from that very space. "But why?" she asked. Lena turned to her, her face serious. "There's something in this house. It's not the house itself, but something, or someone, bound to it. Something that died here. Something restless." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. "Restless?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Lena nodded. "When a person dies with unfinished business or is the victim of something tragic, their spirit can become trapped. It's possible that whoever is here didn't die naturally. Something violent happened to them." Sarah's eyes widened. The house had been abandoned for years before they moved in. No one had lived there for a long time, but the thought of something or someone dying there in such a violent way made her stomach turn. Lena motioned for them to follow her to the living room, where she began setting up her equipment. "We need to conduct a seance," she said. "It's the only way to make contact and find out what's truly happening here." The air grew heavy as Lena spoke the words to summon the spirit. Sarah held her breath, her pulse pounding in her ears. Tom's hand gripped hers, his knuckles white with fear. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped. A cold breeze seemed to swirl around them, though the windows were shut tight. The footsteps began again. This time, they were loud, deliberate, and filled with anger. The presence was stronger than ever, and Sarah could feel it pressing in on them. The footsteps echoed louder and faster, and then, all at once, they stopped. In the eerie silence, Lena spoke. "What do you want?" The air grew thick with tension, and a voice, low and gravelly, whispered from the darkness. "Leave now." Tom's eyes widened with terror, and Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. She wanted to run, but her body was frozen in place. Lena's face paled, and she slowly began to back away. "This spirit is angry. It doesn't want us here. It's been waiting for someone to finally listen." The footsteps returned, louder than ever, as though the spirit was trying to drive them out. Sarah and Tom stumbled back, retreating toward the door. As they rushed out of the house, the footsteps echoed behind them, chasing them out. They ran to the car, heartbeats racing, but the footsteps didn't stop. They followed them down the street, as if the spirit was determined to never let them escape. Days passed, and Sarah and Tom never returned to the house. They packed their things and left in the dead of night, never looking back. But the footsteps, they never stopped. Whenever Sarah lay in bed, alone in the quiet of the night, she would hear them again. The footsteps that followed her everywhere, always just behind her, always just loud enough to remind her that some things could never be outrun. The house had been abandoned once again, its doors and windows sealed, but the footsteps still echoed through the empty halls, forever, relentlessly.